Hello, good evening, Jonathan. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you?
I'm fine. Is it evening for you already? It's getting
No,
late here.
it's lunchtime for me,
Lunchtime.
so not even 1 o'clock yet.
All right. So you're going to talk about GraphQL, right?
Hmm. Yep.
Yes. Yeah. So there was some talk about GraphQL this morning about how GraphQL got added to Umbraco, I think, or Hardcore
Yes.
in this case. And
Yes.
then there were questions about, okay, is this going to be open source? Can we get this in Umbraco as well? Are you going to enlighten people on how to add GraphQL to Umbraco today? Or
No,
is it
no.
just a
So
general talk?
today's just a here's what GraphQL is and here's why it's not
Right.
scary. Let's just talk about it real quick because it is available now in hardcore. And so now people get a sense that it's a real thing that they can actually do. And so I
Mm-hmm.
just want to dip the toe in and say, here's just a little bit about it, what it is, and why you would use it, and then let people explore from there.
Right. Well, then I would like to give you the floor to do so. So take it
All
away.
right. I'm going to share my screen and tell me if that works for you.
I'm going
Awesome.
to check. Yep, we
All
have your
right.
screen.
All right, so we're going to talk just a little bit about GraphQL, but before I do, I want to set the stage with what data we're using and kind of the environment most of us work in today. And so I'm going to introduce to you the Star Wars API or SWAPI, which I'm sure they don't want me to refer to it by, but that's what I'm going to call it. And the Star Wars API is a more of a traditional REST API. And so if you're using a backend system and you're building a front end solution for that, typically in today's world, you're doing a REST call. And so what REST looks like, let's actually flip over and we'll play with this for just a second. So typically you have something like this, right? You go to the URL and then slash people and then slash an ID and you get back Luke Skywalker. Or if you want to do slash people slash two, I actually don't know who this is. It's the first time I've done that. You're going to get somebody else. For some reason, it didn't work, but that's fine. We're going to go with it. And so, but where REST starts to become interesting is people also go have other things associated with them. So, like here, you see there's a home world, right? And so Luke Skywalker has a home world of Tatooine, right? And then Tatooine has residents. And so when you start doing REST and you have all this nested data and you have all these other things, REST starts to become a little bit complicated because now you've got to make multiple calls back and forth and you're always getting this data. So the planet always looks like this. And you may not want that data. And so we're going to take this REST implementation of the Star Wars API, and we're going to play a little bit, play it with it a little bit as a GraphQL API, just so you can get an idea of what GraphQL is like. So let's talk through this for just a second, so we can kind of get going. All right. So GraphQL. I've said it a couple times, and why are we talking about it right now? It's actually kind of funny. When Hank and I started talking about this event and coming out, I did a quick search and noticed that Hardcore now supports GraphQL. And so there's just we were talking about this just a second ago in the intro, right? Is Umbraco has now allowed this GraphQL implementation for the headless CMS for Hardcore. And now a lot of you who are using Umbraco get to start switching over and looking at something. But ultimately the question is why? Like, so now it supports GraphQL, so what? Why switch over to this instead of doing things the way you always have done them before? And that's going to be the entire purpose of what we talk about here. So first and foremost, this is how most applications are built today, right? You've got a web browser or a laptop that connects to a backend API. So in this case, GraphQL, and that's how things work. But more and more over time, the it's changed a little bit. So now you've got phones, you've got apps, native apps that hit that same API. But the problem is that native application is sometimes pared down a little bit. It doesn't need all the same information that the laptop needed. And so you find yourself either consuming more information than you need over a not very good connection sometimes, or you have to create separate endpoints for the mobile endpoint versus the native endpoint. And then it gets more complicated because we have watches. I actually have one, and the watch needs different information. And for some reason that I haven't fully understood, now we have refrigerators that find the need to go and hit API endpoints as well. And so I don't know, right? As so the traditional REST API endpoint doesn't necessarily work in the scenario of we have multiple clients who have to hit the same backend endpoints but need slightly different data or need things differently. And that's where GraphQL comes in. So let's talk about this kind of in a structured way so we can kind of look at it. Let's talk about films for a second. Right, so let's look at what a film looks like in the context of the REST API. So if you go to /films, you get this. You get a title, you get an episode ID, opening crawl. All of this information comes back associated with a film. Now, if I want to build a GraphQL client that's going to call a GraphQL endpoint around Star Wars films, then we have a fundamentally different approach to how we deal with this. So the first thing to keep in mind, GraphQL, the QL is a query language, right? So now we start to think about this endpoint. So I have this set of data. I want to think about this endpoint as if I'm querying a database or something like that. And so the first thing we have to do when it comes to data around films is we have to have a schema. And this is going to be a fundamental difference between GraphQL and REST is if you want to start to build an endpoint that lets you query it instead of just go pull things from it, you have to define what it looks like. And so we have this thing in GraphQL called a schema. And in this case, the schema would just be exactly what you see on the screen, the title, the episode ID, and all of that, but associated with a type. So what is an ID? Or what is the title of the film? And you break those down into types. So now it's a little bit more predictive as to what types of things you're getting back. So int, float, string, Boolean, those types of things are what you have when you're querying a GraphQL endpoint. So you take this data that is a Star Wars film and you create a schema around it. And so it ends up looking like this. And this is the type of thing that you get to query. And so real quick, let's play with this for just a minute. But if you go into to Heartcore, you actually get this cool little interface, the GraphQL Playground, that lets you play around with the queries that you would do to get data back. And so I'm going to use something similar to this. I wanted to show you this so that you know you have access to this. I'm going to use the Apollo Playground that I have for my Apollo GraphQL, but it operates almost exactly, not almost, it operates exactly the same way this does. So let's actually look at what it looks like to query a film in GraphQL. So first and foremost, that schema is published. So when you attach to an API, that schema that we just talked about is sent with the API to the client. And so I have a notification. So right here, you can actually see the schema associated, and a film's got a title, an episode, an opening crawl, all of these things associated with it right there. And so I can actually say, hey, I want to query. And then what queries do I have? I actually have to scroll down a little bit and say, hey, here's the queries. And this is another thing about GraphQL. It self-documents. These are the things that I am allowed to query. And right now I can only query films and planets. And that's it. So in my query, I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to use the query get films. And it returns back an array of films. And so you can just look at the schema, and even if we didn't know anything about this API, I can look at this schema and just say, oh, I understand what's going on here. So it's returning back an array of films. What data do I want? Really, honestly, right now, I just want the title. I want just the title. Well, maybe we should pull back the ID. The episode ID. And run that. And let's hide this. And look at this. Now I have my films. I've queried my films, and I just have the title and the episode ID. Now, some people are pretty hardcore about their Star Wars films, and they will only watch films by certain directors. So let's actually add the director so we know like which films we're going to watch and which films are just garbage, right? And depending on who you are, you'll have a different opinion. But that's kind of how that flow is going to go. And so this is the idea and how that works through. The struggle with this is that data is not just a piece of data and then that's it. We'll come back to this in a second because I'm going to try and go a little bit fast. But we have sub-objects. So a film doesn't just look like this. It actually looks like this. I've got characters and planets and starships. And so when I pull a film back, I also want to pull back sub-data. So I want to pull back character data or planet data or things like that. And so we actually start seeing a schema that looks like this. Notice I've got characters, which returns people, and starships, which returns an array of starships, and those types of things. And so our schema starts to grow and get bigger and allow us to do some of this querying. And so let's just go back. We'll play around with this for just a second. So here I have a type of people that lets me know what people look like. And I know that a film has characters that are people. So what I should be able to do is just come in here and say, hey, I want the characters associated with this film. Now the characters returns back people. So here I've got people, right? And so I want to pull back, again, I have to specify specifically, I want to pull back the name of those people. And I want to run that, and there you go. Now I have A New Hope and the data, or the characters associated with the film A New Hope. Now, how do we limit? How do we query things? So right now, I'm just returning back everything, and this is simple. You can drop this into your client, and this is how it's going to query data. But really, I don't want just all the films. I only want the first film. So episode 4. Right, the first film, episode 4. We all get that. We know why that is, and so what we do is you can actually come down to your query in your schema and say, look, I'm allowed to filter by episode ID, and so that's what we're going to do. We're actually just going to come right up here, and it's in the schema. I can just say, hey, look, episode ID of 4, and we're going to run that, and now I just have A New Hope, and that's it. If I collapse my characters, you'll see everything else went away. And so that it's very much just querying the way you normally would, right? We get films, you go to episode ID of 4. You can build out specifically the things you're asking for, and it nests, right? So characters have a name, but characters, if we go back to our schema, characters also have a homeworld. And so I can come over here to my characters and just say, hey, give me my homeworld and the name of my homeworld. And I can run that. And now look, Luke Skywalker's from Tatooine, R2-D2's from Naboo, and so on and so forth. And so really, kind of what I want you to take away from this, because this is just a lightning fast, short little, hey, this is GraphQL talk, is this. When you start talking about GraphQL, we start to fundamentally rethink how we deal with APIs, right? Because no longer is it resource-based. So In REST, it's representational state transfer, right? But it's a resource base, so everything's around /people or /homeworld. In GraphQL, now we think about it more data-based and more query-based. So I define in my schema the types of things I can query on. If we go back over here and look, in my schema, I can say, hey, these are the things you're allowed to query. And I'm defining these are the things that you're allowed to limit on, right, and filter on. And this is what comes back. And so it's just a different thought around how a API works. One more thing I want to talk about, because it's not all querying data, right? At some point, you have to change data. And in GraphQL, we have this thing called a mutation. And instead of posts, where it posts and puts like Rust has, in GraphQL, we have this thing called a mutation. And so what a mutation does is modify things. And so in this specific case, we define a type of mutation that says, hey, you can modify a planet. And it's going to take an input type of planet, and this is what you're allowed to do. This is the little box you're allowed to play in. And so instead of just opening up the planet and saying, hey, here's all the things you can modify on a planet, you can now very specifically say, here's the specific thing I'm allowing you to do, and build an endpoint just around that little piece. And so what you end up with in here, first of all, let's add a query right here. I'm going to take 2 more minutes, and we're going to add a query. So I have a get planets query. And that get planets query is going to return the name of the planet and the population of the planet and the ID of the planet. Now I'm super on the down low doing something that is pretty incredible that you may or may not have noticed. In one click of this play button, in one post back to the endpoint, I conducted 2 queries. Like, here's my get planets query, and here's my get films query. Both of them were executed. And so you can actually now with GraphQL, if you have a whole bunch of different things you need to execute, you can send them all in one package and get all the data back at one time. So that's the idea there. Okay, but now you see, hey, I have a planet, Alderaan, with a big, huge population. I'm going to create a new tab, and we're going to call a mutation. I'm going to change this data. And we're going to say, hey, I'm going to modify the planet. Now, this takes the planet as an input, right? And so what we send is what changed. So I'm going to send the ID of 2, which is Alderaan. And I'm going to send the new population of Alderaan. And I'm going to run that. Oh, and then I'm going to return back, right? So the error I just got was, hey, you have to have a subfield selection. I forgot to, so we need a name of the planet, and let's get the ID of the planet, and let's get the population of the planet. Now let's run it. And now you see Alderaan had an unfortunate interaction, and that carries through everywhere else. And so that's kind of the idea. That's a whirlwind tour, and that's kind of the point of this talk. We have 15 minutes, 20 minutes to kind of go through this. So I just wanted to take kind of a whirlwind. GraphQL is not scary. It's basically just a query-based API instead of a REST-based API. And what I want you to do with this is go and start to look at a couple of different things. The first thing I want you to look at is consuming a GraphQL API with Apollo client and React. So if you're building a front end in React, so out on Pluralsight, Aditi has this awesome course that consumes these GraphQL APIs with Apollo client. Apollo is something you'll want to keep in mind. Apollo is pretty much, in my opinion, only mine, kind of the gold standard for GraphQL when it comes to clients and servers. You already potentially have the server with Heartcore, the client side, if it's React or iOS or whatever, Apollo will have you covered. So there's a course out on Pluralsight that does this, or you can go to the Apollo website and work through their tutorials, their demos, all of that stuff. It's all right there, and it'll get you going a little bit deeper into this. So that is a whirlwind tour of just the very basics of GraphQL. There's so much more there, but really more than anything, I just wanted you to know what there is and kind of what that mentality shift is, and then you can take that and run with it as you go. All right, so that's me. And then we can flip back over to the guys in the studio.
Interesting talk. I remember the first time that I saw GraphQL. It was like a penny drop moment for me because
Right.
you can do multiple queries at the same time. You can query in like almost a typed way, like with objects.
Yep.
How your data is represented. It makes a ton of sense. I've still yet to use it in a project actually. Kind of old habits die hard, I guess, and you fall back to simple REST APIs at times.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about though is that everybody I talk to who does REST API endpoints always do kind of REST-ish API endpoints. Like they're not really REST. They kind of have to tweak things as they go, and that's where GraphQL is more of a framework and there's less rigidity to it. We've done it on several massive enterprise projects, and the iOS team and the client team both love it because it just, now they don't have to come to me as the backend developer to tell me how to change my endpoints. They can just query how they want to and not have to worry.
Exactly. That's exactly where it excels. It's for the client implementer. Sorry. They can dictate the model that they want and dictate the data that they want, and you just have to make sure all of that data is available to them somehow. Whereas with REST, you've got schema and then versioning as well becomes a whole big challenge in itself. So yeah, really fantastic introduction. And you mentioned Heartcore, of course, with GraphQL. There is a GraphQL open source project that also runs on top of Umbraco. It doesn't have mutations. It's purely read only, and it was kind of a prototype. So it's certainly not a finished solution, but I know people that are using it in production. So it's definitely something that's coming into the Umbraco world. Hopefully we'll see a bit more of it in the years to come.
Excellent. All right, thank you guys for having me, and thanks for putting on this event. In the COVID world, right, everything's a little different, but you have still managed to put on a fantastic event.
Well, yeah, it's been a really good day, and thank you for being our penultimate session.
Thank you very much.